Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Biblical Record. My name is Andrew, as y'all already know that. Um, Tonight we have a interesting show. We have Matthew Long with us. He is a gentleman who co-hosts with the Flat Earth podcast. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Yes, and with David Weiss, and he's going to give us a biblical perspective on why the Earth may not be exactly how you think it is. So let's go ahead and get on with it. How you doing, Matt?
Yeah, doing well, man. Just happy to be on the record here with my brother Andrew. So
Yeah, of course. All right, so I guess people more know David. Let's get a little more about Matt. So give us your background, all that stuff.
sure, like David and I are probably as close to opposites as you can get. Like we're different heights. I have more hair than he does. We come from different backgrounds. Dave is much more mature than I am. He's kind of on. He's almost to grandchildren stage. I still have 7 children at home, so I've got a very busy life. I stumbled across this topic about 2015, and man, it was just something that really shot me right in my heart. I felt like the first time I heard about it that I was listening to truth. I then took a couple years looking into it, testing it, doing all kinds of things to try and prove myself wrong or prove my heart wrong. But when I first heard about it, I heard what the Bible said about it. I really felt like, man, we've been lied to about what the shape of the earth actually is. And what really got me was what the Bible said about it. So that's kind of brought me to here. It actually led me to speaking at a bunch of conferences. I met my wife at that conference, and there's more children born into this world because of that. So it's been a journey that's brought me closer to God, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. So happy to be here to talk about it.
Yeah, it's my wife and I. We're all on the same page here. What I always tell people is, how come you believe the government on this, but you don't believe them on this? Or how can you trust this, but you don't trust that? And it's kind of the same thing. It's, well, people are like, well, people have been in space and they've seen all of it. Have they, though? Have they really? I mean, there's multiple times on actual video that astronauts have been told or have mentioned that we haven't even left low Earth orbit. So how do we really? I mean, it's one of those things where it's like they can't hide it, and they're kind of telling us. It's like they have to tell us, but yet they're trying to, it's a weird topic, but
yeah, I've taken a little bit of different mindset lately. One, my YouTube channel was deleted. It's no longer out there. And so that was kind of a bummer. I had a bunch of videos and stuff on there, and my Twitter got taken down. I'm trying to survive on Instagram and Telegram, and trying to get back on Twitter. So I'm at Matt Son of Chris on all those platforms. You can find me there for as long as they let me stay up. But I've started thinking about it more like, if I was going to talk to someone about flat Earth, which is kind of, it's got a lot of stigma to it. But if I was to talk to someone about flat Earth, one, I've never seen the curve and I've never felt the motion. And the person I'm talking to has never seen the curve and never felt the motion. Yet I'm supposed to sit there and somehow convince them that the earth is flat and motionless. That's kind of a weird argument. I feel like they should be trying to convince me that the earth is spinning 1,040 miles an hour at the equator, flying through space, and somehow we can't experience it in our daily lives.
Let's talk about that real quick. I mean, I've seen all the models, where it shows like the earth spinning, and then it's like spinning through space and all that stuff. I mean, if you really think about it, if you use common sense, like if you really just slow down and just take it in and you think about it, we should be seeing everything doing this, right? I mean, one would think.
Right. Well, the argument is the earth is so large that, the earth is supposedly 24,000 miles in circumference, and we're spinning 1,000 miles an hour. So that's only one rotation a day. So they say that the RPMs are such that you wouldn't actually feel it. I personally think you would, because not only are we spinning at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, we're also going around the sun at 60,000 miles an hour. And then the sun is going through the galaxy at 450,000 miles an hour. And then the universe is supposedly expanding at over 1 million miles an hour. So when you have these things like long range shooters saying they adjust for the Coriolis effect, which is supposedly the earth spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, well, why aren't you adjusting for going around the sun at 60,000 miles an hour, or the sun going through the galaxy at 450,000 miles an hour? There's a lot of these things which flat earthers tend to be up to school on. So someone who doesn't believe in flat earth probably wouldn't know that the earth even spins at 1,040 miles an hour at the equator, or that the sun is 93 million miles away, or the math for lack of curvature. So these are things that people who believe in flat earth are looked upon from the outside as if they don't actually know anything. They haven't done their homework, when it's actually the exact opposite. It's because we've looked into these issues with the heliocentric model that we've actually chosen to now pursue another model, chosen to speculate on another model, and that's the flat motionless model.
Yeah. And I mean, and for one, I used to live in Florida. My family still is there. I moved ahead of them. They'll be up here soon. But whenever you look out in the ocean, it's pretty flat. I mean, there's people that say, well, you can't see it unless you're like so high. And it's like, yeah, but from the math that they have, you should be seeing curve at some point. But then how can you dispute the videos where the person sees like a ship, it goes over the edge, they zoom in and you can still see the whole ship?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, everywhere you are on Earth, we experience a flat, non-rotating Earth. That's what we experience. That's what our senses tell us. And according to NASA, you aren't able to see curvature until you're up above 70,000 feet, which conveniently is like 20,000 feet higher than what private jets are allowed to fly at. However, there are areas, not from the left to right, but front to back, where we have many examples where you should be seeing curvature. And by curvature, I mean you should be seeing things disappear over the horizon where they're not. And you gave a good example of the fact that people talk about ships disappearing over the edge, when in fact they're actually just going beyond your eye's angular resolution. And when you pull out a bigger lens, like a zoom telescope or a camera, you can actually pull that ship back into view, which is an astonishing feat. You've got the Chicago skyline, which can be seen across Lake Michigan, which should be fully hidden by the horizon. You've got the mountains of Canigao. You've got the world record photograph of 275 miles, I believe it was, somewhere in France, where you can see these mountains and they should be hidden by 10 miles of curvature. So these are things that you shouldn't be able to see on a ball. The state of Kansas, for example, which, by the way, Kansas is only the 9th flattest state. Florida is actually the flattest.
Really?
Kansas, which is Kansas is supposed to be as flat as a pancake, right? Well, Kansas is 410 miles across. Okay, that means there should be a 20-mile high bulge in the middle. Yeah, which theoretically we're not allowed to experience because we can't get high enough. But in my mind, you've got a 20-mile high missing bulge in the middle of Kansas. And I just wonder how many flat pieces of land and how many flat pieces of water, like Lake Michigan, do you have to put together to create a ball? And the answer is you can't.
Yeah. Speaking of, not being allowed to, why? I mean, I guess here's the big question, and I know I'm bringing this up early, but it's a very important question to people. For people that aren't quite there, their biggest question is going to be, what's the point of hiding this? What's the point of,
Well, I actually like the why question, because the why question for me was quite an obvious motive, and it's one of the things that drove me. Because one, I don't think government tells the truth. I don't think Satan tells the truth, and I think they're kind of from in the same camp, in my opinion.
Sure.
So Romans 1:20 says that you can get to know your Creator through the things that were made, including His eternal power, including His the Godhead, it says. And if that's the case, if you can get to know God through the creation, then of course there's going to be an evil agenda to cover up what that creation is and dilute it. And the way you dilute something is you pour it into something bigger, and convince us that we're merely statistical probabilities of an ever expanding, potentially infinite universe. Now, when I was in my 20s, I didn't want to read the Bible. Why? Because I believed in the Big Bang. I believed in evolution. I believed in the heliocentric spinning solar system. And because of that, page 1 of Genesis sounded kind of like a fairy tale to me. Like, it sounded unbelievable. So if I couldn't get if I couldn't believe page 1, why would I read page 2? So for a current Christian who already believes in Jesus, this is not a salvational issue, the shape of the earth. But for someone whose stumbling block is mainstream science, this could absolutely be a salvation issue. And there's many, many people who have found flat earth through YouTube or wherever, TikTok now, and have decided that that's truth, and then have also found out, hey, the Bible's been teaching this for 2,500, 1,500 to 2,500 years, depending on which book you're reading. And science changes every year. You've got the first edition, third edition, fourth edition. The Bible is still in its first edition and hasn't changed. And it's because truth can't change, right? The Bible's truth.
Yeah, God.
So, yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking of science and could be a stumbling block, I know some people where that's, where they like, well, I know the science and it just doesn't work, or I've done this and because of the physics of it, there's no way that could happen. And my kind of point to them is, yeah, but it's easy for math to work if you make up the math. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And a lot of times people say, well, the math doesn't work because they're using a model that we don't believe in. They're using the meme of the square earth floating through the solar system in the middle of space, which no flat earthers believe, right? It shows the little ships about to fall off the edge. We don't believe that. We don't believe in a solar system. We believe in an earth system where these sun, moon, and stars are located within our essentially a snow globe, with the North Pole in the center, the South Pole at the edge, and the sun, moon, and stars placed within the dome beneath the waters, just like it describes in over 200 verses in the Bible. If you take all those verses, that's what it describes.
Yeah. Do you have any verses that you could bring up right now? I mean, because right now you're essentially making a case for this, and there's going to be people watching this later that are going to be like, well, okay, prove it.
Well, so I have a whole book. It's called The House That Jesus Built. It's on Amazon. The House That Jesus Built by Matt Long. Look it up. That has a full chapter on exactly what the Bible says. But if I were to start with the first example that a lot of Christians, a lot of pastors love to use and say that it disproves my argument, they like to use Isaiah 40:22, where Isaiah talks about the circle of the earth. Okay. So they say circle. See, he's talking about the ball. Well, unfortunately, there is a Hebrew word for ball, and it's not the word that he uses in 40:22. In Isaiah 20:18, he uses the Hebrew word for ball, but when he talks about the earth, he uses the word circle. Okay, a pizza is a circle. It's not a ball. It's a circle, and it's flat. Okay, when you have when Joshua is chasing the Amalekites down, and he asks God to keep the sun in the sky longer so that he can defeat his enemy, that doesn't work on a ball. If you stop the spin of the earth, everything keeps going. And the interesting thing about that is the Bible says that God stopped the sun and the moon over certain locations. One, meaning that they're smaller and they're local, not off into infinite space. They're small and they're local, but the moon also stopped. If the earth was simply to stop spinning, the moon would keep going, because the only reason supposedly we think the sun moves is because the earth is spinning. But that's the earth-sun relationship. That doesn't involve the moon relationship.
Right. And also, on the flip side of that, if the earth was spinning around the sun, he would have said he stopped the earth.
Right. Yes. Yeah. He's absolutely. They said he stopped the sun.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, looking at it, because Christians, especially like Ken Ham, talks about observational science. And I think that's very important, especially in this topic, because, for instance, in Genesis, where it talks about the firmament and the waters above and the waters below, I mean, that's impossible, right? Obviously, but it's not impossible. I mean, the thing about the Bible is that, I guess to backtrack, people would say that's impossible because we know there's a space and all that other stuff. But what if there is water above there, right? I mean, it's something that I think is going to shake a lot of people when they find out that there is that things are not the way how that they're supposed to be. And I had
Right.
a thought, but it just like left my mind for whatever reason. So I'm gonna let you go ahead.
Well, yeah, so picture if you were in a bathtub, okay? That's what I think this place is. It's a bathtub. You can't get out of the bathtub, okay? Because there's sides, okay? Water's not spilling off. Water's hitting the sides, and if you were to take an upside down bowl and sink that down into the water, okay, it's going to capture air inside that bowl while it's upside down, right? So you've basically got a pressurized atmosphere inside that bowl. And when God says he opened the windows of heaven to flood the earth, right? If you were to poke a hole in that bowl, what would happen? Water would rise up from underneath. So that's the fountains of the great deep bursting forth. Okay. So God literally, yes, it rained, but he basically flooded it from underneath, right? It's the way I see it. I mean,
Yeah.
there are over 200 verses in the Bible that say the earth is a still, flat earth set on pillars under a dome. It says the earth is fixed and motionless. It said it's been established, so not moving. Every time that the earth talks about the sun, moon, and stars, they are the ones that are moving, not the earth.
Yeah. Interesting thing about that, about the flooding and such, like how you bring how it comes from the water. Are you familiar with Dr. Carl Baugh?
Yes.
Yeah, and he has some hypothesis, I guess would be the word, about how, because I guess the earth has not really rained until the flood. So before then, the way how everything got watered is that water came from the ground, watered everything that needed to be watered,
The
and
mist.
then that's how it's sustained. And then also, which could explain the waters above and waters below, the way how he explained it made sense, where it's a metallic hydrogen with a water lattice above and below
Hmm.
the bonded hydrogen, metallic hydrogen,
Sure.
which makes sense.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
interesting. I mean, there's a lot of great theories, and it's all speculation. I personally take a literal view of these verses. It's possible to take a non-literal view of these verses, but even if they're non-literal, I just don't think God would paint a picture of our
yeah,
world and paint a picture of his relationship. The Bible says that he resides upon the sides of the north. That sounds a little bit weird, except when you understand the north is right in the center. The
yeah,
north is the center of the pizza that I described. So
yeah,
North Pole at the center, Antarctica is the crust. Okay. So God resides just above the north. And in Revelation 4:3, John goes to heaven. And what does he see? He sees an emerald rainbow around the throne of God. The northern lights are a green rainbow, right? So I used to live in Canada around the 55th parallel, and I would see the northern lights. Well, it's quite a different experience thinking that those northern lights could actually be the emerald rainbow around the throne of God that John was seeing.
yeah, and that makes sense. And on what you're saying about the literal and non-literal of the Bible, the big thing that also people say is, "Oh, that's figurative," or "That's not literal." The Bible is actually to be taken completely literal unless mentioned otherwise in the Bible. So the Bible will specify when it's a parable, when it's a exaggeration, or when it's a um, like a phrase, like like
Metaphor.
he'll specify those things, and when it doesn't, it's to be taken literal,
Yeah,
right?
I totally agree. So, when Job was getting schooled by God in Job 38, right? So people love to use the verse Job 26:7, where it says God hangs the earth on nothing. So that sounds like a spinning ball flying through space. But it's true. He didn't hang the ball, he didn't hang it on anything. It's set on a foundation on pillars, just like he says later in Job 38. And that's not something we can say, oh, the author is just writing according to his beliefs. No, because those were God's words. God
Right.
said, where were you when I created the foundations of the earth? How
Yeah.
can a ball that's spinning in four different directions, how can that possibly have a foundation? It says the earth is established on its
Right.
foundation, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the firmament, that's called, people like to say, well, that's the expanse of the sky. No, it's literally defined later as God's looking glass, like a see-through looking glass. It would be um,
Yeah.
a convex lens, right? And molten looking glass
Yeah.
is the word
I
used
want to
for it.
say, and I don't remember. Forgive me. I don't remember if it was Jeremiah or Isaiah, but it was the firmament was referred to as a terrible crystal.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the word rakia, I believe what it comes from this notion of like beating out metal, right? So it's tough to beat out an airy expanse with a
Yeah.
tool, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's a good way. I love
I
how you're using biblical references. I think that's very
sure.
important. And
Well, I
people
think
that are listening, uh, when someone if someone ever tells you anything about the Bible and they use biblical references, obviously make sure they're not taken out of context, but that's also someone that has, because when you use the Bible as context, that's always good context to have, provided that they're not misinterpreting the Bible. But I mean, this is more of a literal subject, so it's not there's not really necessarily an interpretation thing. It's more of this is what the Bible's saying literally. But anyway, go ahead.
sure. Well, I think most people's reservation, and this even includes the pastor of the church I go to. I love my pastor. I love the church, but man, he loves space. He loves the moon landing. He's got books on the constellations, which are amazing books, and they're about how God literally tells the entire story through the constellations, which I believe that he does, and I agree with my pastor on that. But he has a different worldview than I do, and he made a comment about how it couldn't be daytime here and nighttime on the other side of the world if we were on a flat earth, which is totally wrong. It's totally incorrect. No flat earther would believe in a model that could be disproven like that.
Yeah. Well, here's
Miscon-
another thing, though. I'm going to interrupt you real quick. Here's
sure.
another thing: is that we had day and night before the moon and the sun and the before the sun and the moon even existed.
That's very true. That's my favorite one. One, people believe we live on an earth that revolves around the sun. Well, the sun wasn't created until 3 days after the earth. And like you said, exactly, we had evening and morning 3 times before the sun was even created. So good luck doing that with your heliocentric solar system, right?
Yeah.
But we believe in a model where circumnavigation is still possible, sunrise and sunset is still possible. You're not going to fall off the edge, and you're going to experience life the exact same way you experience life right now. And we actually have explanations for it. So get past the whole like it's not possible and talk to someone who actually believes in it and get to know what they actually believe in before condemning it, because I think people, and especially Christians, they're a little bit standoffish from it because they think it makes Christians sound dumb when they say they're a flat earther or when they say they don't believe we live on a spinning ball flying through space. But in fact, that person has actually flipped a switch in their head that they don't just believe everything because they see it on a screen. They see artwork on a screen and believe that that's what's happening. So that person deserves a little bit of respect for the amount of time and the amount of discernment and the amount of research that they've put into to discover these things. And by the way, boldness to say, to be a flat earther, by the way, it's like the dumbest thing someone could possibly believe in, right? According to outside opinion. So for someone to say, I'm okay with the ridicule, I'm going to believe in a flat earth, there's obviously something going on. These people
Well,
aren't
as
idiots.
Christians, we should be used to persecution anyway. I mean, after all, Jesus did say that they don't hate you; they hate me. So
exactly. And if there is one, science has an agenda. We've seen that over the last 2 years. But if science and the Bible diverge, you don't need to be scared as a Christian. You need to go find what the biblical explanation of it is and stick to that. Don't be swayed in the wind by these people in lab coats who aren't any closer to the evidence than you are. Go out, study it, and develop an opinion of your own.
yeah. Let's talk about the sun and the moon. I mean, what would be your perception of the sun and the moon as a physical entity in the sky? I
Okay.
mean, obviously they both look the same size. I mean, how else could you have an eclipse if they're different? I mean, me personally, I don't buy that the moon that the sun is so far away. In fact, there was actually a well-known scientist that pointed out. I don't know where he was on faith or not, but he pointed out, the moon is actually a plasma, which could make sense. So,
yeah, I remember seeing an interview with a scientist, which would have been before the Apollo
it was
mission.
1965, I believe.
Yeah, talking about how he was convinced the moon was plasma. We'd never land on it. So that was a highly interesting interview. As far as the sun and moon go, I'm going to start with the moon. One, you can look at the moon in the sky, and you can look at a picture of the 1960s and 70s astronauts on the moon, the gray dust ball, and the two don't match. If you look at the sun, at the moon in the sky, it looks like a light bulb. I can show that to my 11-year-old daughter. I can show it to my 5-year-old daughter, and she would be able to say, no, that's a light. That's a light up in the sky. And then that picture of the astronaut on that gray dust ball, that's something totally different. It's different because the landing on the moon never happened. Okay.
Right.
The moon, in my opinion, is giving off its own light. It's not reflecting the light of the sun. Jesus said that the moon gives her own light in Matthew 24, maybe 24, 29. Matthew chapter 24, I believe it's verse 29, but not for sure. It's definitely Matthew 24. He says that the moon would cease to give her light. So, and that can be proven, by the way. The moon gives off cold light. The sun gives off warm light. You can go out at nighttime and stand in the moonlight and take a laser thermometer, point it on the ground. During the daytime, if you go into the shade, it gets cooler. And during the nighttime, if you go in the shade, it gets warmer. And you can do that by pointing the thermometer on the ground. So the moon is giving off cold light. If it was reflecting the light of the sun, that would be the same light. It would do the exact same thing as it does during the day. So what is the sun? In my opinion, the sun is something like the rainbow. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the sun that we see in our sky, in my opinion, is something called a focal image. So you had the light that was created on day one in Genesis. You know, I think that literally emanates from the throne of God. Jesus is the light of the world. I don't know how that works, but that's what I think. It has something to do with God and Jesus. That's the light created on day one. On day two, you create what's called the firmament, which is the dome. And that, like I said, is a convex lens. When you shine parallel light rays down on a convex lens, what happens is they converge and, you know, and create right at this convergence point something called a focal point. And if you were to have something on one side of the lens, you could actually create an upside down image of it on the other side that you could put your hand through. So to me, the sun would be like a rainbow. Just like you could never reach a rainbow, you could never reach the sun. It's why you can set up a camera on the ground and shoot planes flying through the sun, when if you were on the plane, you wouldn't be flying through the sun. You would see the sun somewhere else. If you and I were on a beach and I'm looking at the sun and the trail of light is leading all the way to my feet, and then you're 250 yards down the beach and you also see the trail of light going to your feet, but I can't see the trail going to your feet. You can't see the trail going to my feet. The sun is dependent on the observer, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And
let me interject real quick. I did not find the verse that you were talking about. I didn't see it, but in Mark chapter 13, verse 24. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. Same thing. You know, that's showing that the moon has its own light. But
correct.
I have seen the verse that you're talking about somewhere. I just don't recall where it was. So
yeah, I've probably okay. Yeah, so Matthew 24:29.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, Matthew 24:29. The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light.
Yeah, that's the great thing about the Gospels. Sometimes they repeat themselves just differently.
Oh, absolutely. It's great.
Yeah. But yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I'm trying to think of how to word this. I'm not exactly the most articulate man in the world, but when it comes to, you know, the things, and I'm going to kind of go back to NASA and all that stuff. I mean, for people that say that they've seen pictures of the Earth and that they've seen pictures of the moon, because I mean, we've all seen the Artemis and all that kind of stuff, and you know, the moon looks like it's a rock and all that stuff. I mean, what would you say to someone that you know, kind of gives you that as an example? Like what?
Sure. I would ask someone to go on NASA's website and find me a photo of the Earth, because there's a difference between a photo and an image. A photo is a capture of reality. An image is a representation of reality. An image is created. Okay. When someone creates an image, it doesn't mean that they are showing you real life. Now, what does that mean? If you go on nasa.gov, okay, you can find an article where it talks about the very first blue marble image that they created. There's a series of images of the Earth called the Blue Marble series. First one was in 2002. It's the one that everyone saw on their iPhone. And it is basically a direct quote saying that they took a bunch of different pictures and put them all together in Photoshop, added clouds until they had this perfect spherical picture of the Earth. I think it says they hit Control Z a bunch of times to give it some 3D. And that's how they did it. They literally say they laid the flat map over the ball, is what they said. So that was in 2002. The way they create it hasn't changed. We actually, if you can believe that we actually have astronauts up there, we actually can't get far enough away from the Earth in human standards to take a picture of the whole thing. A lot of people don't realize that we cannot leave low Earth orbit. Supposedly, the only time we ever did leave low Earth orbit was when we went to the moon in the 1960s and 70s, and we haven't done it since.
Here's something interesting about that. I'm going to interrupt real quick. There was an idea among astronaut, let's call them space scholars, whatever, and I think that they came up with this because enough people were like, well, about the whole low Earth orbit, that Earth's atmosphere technically goes to the moon, so that could explain why we never really that we still went to the moon, but they could still say that we never left the Earth's atmosphere. So I thought that.
Yeah, actually, I heard that, and it's funny. You get those little things that pop out, and I think it could be partially true that the moon does reside in our atmosphere. I just think it's a lot closer, inside our domed experience, personally.
Yeah, and speaking of the International Space Station, it's an interesting thing. I mean, one, do you think? So when it comes to like gravity, I believe in the law of density. Like that makes most sense. So, because I've seen visually with my own eyes what looks like because I tracked it one time whenever I was younger, and it saw, the ISS fly across the sky, right? And people can track that. Do you think that maybe they utilize the law of density and they actually have a station up there, but maybe it's obviously not in space? Like, how does that make sense? Because really, we don't know how high up the firmament goes.
Absolutely.
Right?
So
we don't.
So I was going to say space starts at the Kármán line, which is 1,000 kilometers or 62.5 miles. I think the firmament could be like 1,000 miles up. So there's a lot of space, I guess, between that Kármán line and where I think man runs out of room to explore, because I think man's domain is Earth and we're not allowed to go beyond that, and that's biblical. So
go ahead.
So what I was going to say is I think everything that happens on the ISS is fake. And I think that because of how many times they've gotten caught with harnesses, with green screens, with people disappearing out of their shot. Like it's laughable how many times they've gotten caught faking something up there. Now, I have seen people recording the transit of the ISS of something going across the moon, across the sun. I've seen a light in the sky, before that they said it's supposed to be the ISS. They say we can see these satellites, right? And they don't have lights on them, by the way. Like what we're seeing is supposedly the sun reflecting off of them, which if you saw a model of how close to the surface these things actually are compared to the sun, it's almost impossible to think that it would actually be bouncing light off and we could see it. Something the size of a truck. I'm in Fort Worth, Texas, and to think that I could see sun reflecting off a truck in Oklahoma City is pretty dumb, right? Like if you're in Tampa, you're not going to see anything in Daytona, right?
Right.
So are they doing things up there? Maybe. Does NASA buy more helium than anyone else in the world? Yes. Do they have a balloon launching facility in Texas? Yes, I've been there. So they put stuff up different ways. Is there an ether current up there that you can shoot things around? Maybe. As you get higher, does the electromagnetic force not play on you as much? And maybe you can float things up there. Do they have technology that we're not aware of? Yes, 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 almost certainly. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, because that's another thing that's always kind of been like, well, because like obviously me and my wife were full on where you are, but there's still some things that like every now and again I'll be like, how did they pull that off? Because from what I could visually see, because again I go off of visual observation. If someone showed me something on a screen, I could care less. I'm like, that could be whatever. But visually, you can see things that you can track. So that's why I figured I'd throw
Yeah,
that.
you can see lights in the sky, that's for sure. But to me, the Earth was proven to be motionless by Michelson and Morley back in the 1800s, and that scientific experiment has been repeated as late as like 1989 or something like that. It's in my
Weren't they
book.
the ones that got killed or something like that?
They're probably dead if it was in the 1800s. I don't know if they got killed, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe Hillary Clinton got to him or something.
Yeah, because I heard someone did some kind of experiment that proved something along those lines, and I think they died shortly after.
So Michelson and Morley were trying to prove the existence of an ether wind, I believe.
Okay, I think that's different.
And they failed, but what they ended up proving is that the Earth was not moving. And in order to combat this, Einstein had already written his theory of relativity, so this forced him to write his special theory of relativity, basically saying that everything reacts relative to something else except for light. So because it was light that proved the Earth wasn't moving, he had to write this special theory of relativity to make an exception for light. That's how that works. So if the Earth isn't moving and we can prove over and over that there's no curvature, which by the way is the main characteristic of a ball, curvature, it just happens to be absent. So if we're not spinning and there's not a ball, then we're forced to say, well, I think this place is flat and motionless. Oh, by the way, that's what the Bible says. That's enough for me to overcome these things like, I'm not real sure what's happening with those lights in the sky, or I'm not real sure what's happening when people are talking about compensating for the Coriolis effect, because I have these other big giant things that to me prove we live on a still flat Earth set on pillars under a dome. And these other small things, I know that there's probably an explanation for them somewhere, but to me, they're correlations and not causations of living on a spinning ball flying through space.
Right. Let's talk about Antarctica a little bit. So there was, I think, in one of this is a debatable, I guess, thing, but to transition into that, there was a section in the encyclopedia, I think, back in '54, that spoke that the firmament started at like 13,000 feet.
Yeah. So Encyclopedia Americana, I believe it was 19.
I think it was 1954, I want to say.
Okay, that sounds about right. It said that basically in Antarctica, they found a dome around the 80th parallel. And yeah, at 13,000, I think at 13,000 feet, maybe, that they said they found it. I've heard crazy explanations for what that really means, supposedly. But
like ice shelf is a dome or something.
Yeah, an ice shelf. But yeah, it's quite startling. Absolutely. Because in theory, you'd think if the North Pole is the center and the South Pole is the outside, and we're talking about that pizza again, if the dome rests on the crust of the pizza, that the dome would be lower towards the south, towards the outside. And yeah, to think that, maybe it's 1,000 miles high in the center, but at the 80th parallel, it's all the way down to 13,000 feet. That's what they tell us. So
yeah, it's really convenient that the treaty for the Antarctica Treaty came out, and then NASA came out shortly after, and all these other things, especially with Admiral Byrd, which I'm not going to get down that rabbit hole because that's wacky about the whole thing. But
yeah. But the crazy thing is they go to Antarctica before the Apollo missions to look for moon rocks. There's pictures of NASA in Antarctica looking for moon rocks. I don't know how you can find something from somewhere you've never been, and why would you go to Antarctica to look for it? That's totally weird. Anyways, when the astronauts get back from Apollo, they donate a moon rock to a museum in Amsterdam, and the museum wanted to put it on display. Well, they wanted to get it insured first. So the insurance company required them to run a test on the moonwalk, and it was proven that it was petrified wood. So it was a fake moon rock. So
Interesting.
maybe they did actually get it from Antarctica. But you're right, Antarctica, the fact that it's off limits, and not just Antarctica, but 200 miles out from Antarctica is off limits from any kind of private exploration whatsoever. You could take a cruise there where they let 10% of the people off the boat at a time. They fly scientists down there on a plane with no windows. I've got a buddy who's been down there for his job, and he says basically you work in one building and you walk in an inflatable tunnel to the next building. You're not allowed beyond anywhere, and they use safety as a reason, which is understandable. It's like minus 200 there, in the winter.
Yeah.
But it's to me, it's the edge. And by edge, I mean the area of this realm where heaven meets earth. So where the firmament comes down and meets earth. It's God in the Bible, it talks about basically him creating the earth like pressing clay against the seal. So if you had the king's signet ring and he puts a little bit of clay, heats it up, and then he pushes his ring down on it, the outsides come up and the middle goes down. And that's what I believe we live on. So we're basically on our pond with the shoreline that goes all the way around. And the Bible says that God did it by basically pushing down his ring. So
Yeah.
I personally think that is a metaphor, but I think it represents our reality. I think it's an accurate depiction of our reality.
Yeah. Now let's go to the other side of this and talk about the Arctic. Is it restricted up there too?
I'm not sure that the Arctic is as restricted as the Antarctic, but I would imagine it is fairly restricted. I could remember growing up and the Arctic was white. There were like ice caps right up there,
Yeah.
and now you look at it and they say it's all water. And there was.
Sorry to interrupt you again. It's just kind of interesting, just because there's some restriction up there, but also whenever you look at old maps, there's land there, and I believe maybe even lush land. Some people believe that might have been where the Garden of Eden is.
Yeah, and I would actually,
because you have 4 rivers going from it, which is talked about in the Bible. So.
Yeah, I actually think that mainstream Christian scientists say that the Garden of Eden is somewhere in Iraq because of the Euphrates and the Tigris being over there, which is what Genesis names. I personally think that Euphrates and that Tigris were renamed after the original. So I don't think it's over there. I was one of those people that thought that the Garden of Eden was in the North Pole. I thought that made the most sense because if God sits over the sides of the north, it would make sense that the garden was right beneath him and that he could watch over Adam and Eve, walk amongst them. There's, like you said, ancient maps of greenery up there. They've found, woolly mammoths with, tropical vegetation in their stomachs and blocks of ice up there. So I definitely think it's possible. I have watched an interesting channel called Old World Florida recently that postulates that Florida is actually, quote, the Fertile Crescent, the Gulf of Mexico, and that it's the only place on the earth that could possibly be the Garden of Eden. And it's the only place that has like a 4-mouthed river. It's the only place in the world where gopher wood grows. And so they think that near Arkansas and Florida, Noah built his ark out of gopher wood, which is what the Bible says, and it's the only place in the world where gopher wood grows. They've found 24 out of the 28 trees in Florida that the Bible mentions in Genesis. So they think Noah built his ark, the waters rose, and then currents took him over to the Middle East, and then he renamed the Tigris and Euphrates after rivers that were over there. Highly interesting stuff. Old World Florida, really cool channel.
Wait, so let me backtrack you a little bit. So what you're saying is, from this channel, that for one, gopher wood is only grown in that area, nowhere else, and which the only thing that would make sense is that's where Noah had to have been. That's interesting. I've never heard that before.
I had never heard it either. Someone sent me a podcast that was on Tinfoil Hat, and they had this guy on there, and his name, it's not his real name, but it's Dr. Narco Longo is the guy's YouTube stage name, I guess. It's really great. And like I said, his channel is Old World Florida, and man, he's got some awesome evidence for not only Florida being the Fertile Crescent, but that Islam was birthed from there, and that the natives that, people think of the red Indian people as being the natives that were here. And he's got a lot of evidence showing that people looked a lot more European, and just, a lot of really cool stuff. And that this wasn't necessarily the new world, right? We obviously know that people were here before Columbus, and yet we're still taught about Columbus in schools, but that this was actually the old world. That possibly this was the pre-flood world.
Well, I guess let me pose this question to you, just because. Do you think that there's any chance that maybe before the flood, the Earth was structured different? So, have you ever heard of the Pangea growing up? Like, do you remember that, where like it was just one huge continent? Do you think maybe that was the case?
I thought about Pangea the other day when I was cooking something and everything. And I had pushed I was making pork chops, and I was trying to get everything on the hot part of the pan, and so I was pushing them all together, and it made me think of Pangea, migrating together.
Yeah.
I think it's totally possible that things are different now than they were pre-flood, and I think it'd be probably ignorant to think that things are exactly the same. So I think that's possible. I think that water levels are much, I would say, higher now than they were before. So I think if you receded the waters on this Earth, if you receded the waters, you'd see a lot of things. You'd see a lot of evidence for things that we don't see now. So I think probably there's less land now than there was before because the waters are higher. And I think at the very least, continent shapes are different because water levels are different. I don't believe in the gradual migration of continents. I don't think mountains are formed by plates coming together over millions of years. I've seen some very interesting experiments showing how land formations can be formed by high discharges of electricity and sand and stuff like that, which is, it's really cool stuff. I can't remember where I saw that, but so, and then being a young earther, which I am, I obviously think things like the Grand Canyon were formed very quickly by a lot of water, as opposed to being formed over millions of years by a little bit of water.
And that's what Dr. Baugh and John Adolphi from the Lost World Museum, you should check his channel out. I think he follows you. But that things actually formed much faster than people thought.
And I probably got that opinion from watching some of his stuff. I have a very classic young Earth my worldview from watching a lot of those guys, watching Answers in Genesis, Institution of Creation Research. And so in that realm, I am right in line with a lot of those guys, Dr. Kent Hovind, right? And but as far as the shape goes, a lot of those guys aren't where I am, or I'm not where they are. And well,
I mean, it's interesting because they actually found fossils of plants that now are smaller, but before they were bigger. And with his theory of based on the magnetic field's change over time, that it did not gradually get weaker, but it drastically after the flood, which would explain a lot of things, because people were living longer before the flood, and then right after the flood, the ages were like cut in half. Things started getting smaller.
Yeah, and I've also heard, I think a lot of them attribute it maybe to they think maybe there was a higher air pressure or something pre-flood, which would also work in my explanation of putting the bowl under the water and letting some air out, right? Because pressure would go down, and I don't know why that translates to smaller plants, smaller animals, less, shorter lifespans.
Well, his thought with that was because of the crystalline the crystalline bonded hydrogen with the water lattice. It created a certain light, that this light was actually proven through experiments to actually accelerate growth of things, which would kind of go in line with John Adolphi's theory of that not only plants were bigger, but we were bigger, because which makes a lot of sense, because there's giants beforehand, that we were bigger because of this certain light and because of how everything was. And then once the flood changed, that's when everything changed and we gradually got smaller. Things did not grow quite at the rate that they did. And then also with that carbon dating, things change as far as their decomposition, because a lot of people go, oh, this is 10 million years old because of this composition, where Carl Baugh said, I think it was Carl Baugh, him or another person said that, oh, we don't know the circumstances that rock was under, so it could have been accelerated in decomposition of radioactivity from certain events.
I totally agree with that, and I've heard a lot of times the example used where you walk into a room and there's a faucet on and there's a bucket filling up, right? And you could take the rate that water's coming out and the size of that bucket and figure out how long it's taken to fill that bucket up, except you don't know how much water started in the bucket, and you don't know if the water's been coming out at that same speed the whole time. And that's the issue with carbon dating.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. And I think on John Adolphi's channel, he has a 3-part series of Carl Baugh going through it, because also, which this is based off of actual evidence that was found through archaeology. And I think that they found this in Texas, where because they say that dinosaurs were millions of years before man, but yet you have man and dinosaurs found in the same sediment layers.
Yeah, I've been to the Creation Museum down in Glen Rose, Texas, near the Paluxy River Valley, where they've got fossils, like you said, of a dinosaur with a human footprint, right smack in this. It's in the same fossil. They have also found a hammer, in rock that should have been millions of years old. And I personally think that not all these dinosaurs that you see actually existed. I think they use a lot of these dinosaurs to cover up giant human bones. So someone comes in and finds a giant human femur or a giant human rib cage. Well, then they put it together and create this, dinosaur, which, by the way, like if you go into a museum like the one in Fort Worth, where I'm from, if you go in there, you see this huge brontosaurus. Well, if you ask the person, they'll tell you, well, they found a rib bone and a hip bone and, a femur bone, and connected it and said, yeah, this looks like this other dinosaur over here. It's a brontosaurus. And then they build this whole thing out of cast fake bones. Like, you're not looking at actual bones. And in fact, if you went back into the drawers with the locked keys on it, you would only find 3 real bones in the whole thing. And then they took an artist to draw a dinosaur for them, which, by the way, dinosaurs used to have scales. Now they draw them with feathers, right? Because that is now what they're saying, is that dinosaurs evolved into birds. But when I was little, dinosaurs had scales. And I like to quote Pastor Chuck Smith out of California. He talks about how, I heard a sermon where he said, when I went to school, the earth was 4 billion years old. Now it's 8 billion years old, but I didn't actually go to school that long ago. Insinuating like he's not 4 billion years old, right? It's because their timeline keeps changing. It has to get longer to account for all of these changes, which has never been observed and never proven.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about science is that science should point out God's creation, true science. I mean, that's why, like, Ken Ham always talks about going with observational science. I mean, if you look at things, there's no other explanation other than creation. You look at the evidence of fossils and stuff, and it really does come down to, I guess, opinion, because you could both look at the same thing and have one opinion and then have completely different, but you're looking at the same thing.
No, you're exactly right. And that's the quandary with evidence. And I used to think, when I would watch the History Channel, I'd watch the Discovery Channel, I would think that I'm looking at evidence. No, I'm looking at a biased interpretation of evidence. Evidence is the same for everyone. You go into a courtroom, one lawyer is trying to convince the judge with the evidence that his client is innocent. The other lawyer is trying to convince the judge with the same evidence that client is guilty. It's now going to be the judge's interpretation of the evidence which decides whether that guy is found guilty or not. The problem is, in the case of, let's say, geology, right? Or, these dinosaurs, let's just say the geological column, where you supposedly have these stacked rocks, where a creationist will see that and you say, oh, that was all laid down at once during Noah's flood. And the non-creationists or the evolutionists will look at it and say, no, that was created over, millions of years of non-catastrophic processes. They're looking at the same thing, but their worldview is dictating what the answer is. And these evolutionists, they'll go into the 15 million year old rock and find an animal and say it lived 15 million years ago. And then they'll go say, well, that rock's 15 million years old because the animal that lives in it's 15 million years old. When their evidence is like circular reasoning, it's based on the other thing, which was based on the previous thing. Like Excel, if you're working in Microsoft Excel, it wouldn't let you do that because it couldn't compute, right? It's like a circular reference. It doesn't work. So yeah, that is the thing about evidence. Like there's a number 6 on the ground. You and I are standing on either side of it. I say it's a 6. You say it's a 9. Who's right? Well, whoever can come up with the best argument. And in my opinion, the biblical argument is the best argument.
100%. Yeah. And there's some things that the Bible that like on something like not everything is mentioned in the Bible. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's one of those things where people have to be careful on, like, for instance, if someone asks me, okay, do you believe aliens exist? Right. I'm going to say no, because it's not mentioned in the Bible. And if God made other life on other planets, he would say so in his word. He would say, go share the gospel amongst the universe, right? But no, he says he says share the gospel over the earth, right? So it's and that's paraphrased, by the way, people. But and I think that's is it possible? Anything's possible with God. I'm not gonna put him in a box, right? But when you look at the evidence and you look at what his word says, I can't have an opinion on it. I think that's where Christians really need to stay is, yes, we can have a theory. Yes, we can have this, but at the end of the day, we have to stick with the Bible and we have to have that as our foundation. And if it's outside, then we need to, we need to be careful on what we say is fact and what is not. And it's kind of the same thing going into what is science and what is not. Is when it comes down to interpretation, is it truth or is it indoctrination? You got to be careful with those things. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, well, I obviously agree with you. I don't believe in aliens from other planets because I don't believe in other planets. Like I think Earth is the pool table. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and just because the pool table is, or just because the ball's on the pool table around, it doesn't mean the Earth is round. So everything, this is all there is. Now, are there lands that we're not allowed to go to? Maybe. What is extraterrestrial? It means extra land. Are there extraterrestrials coming from extra land? Maybe. If there are, they're going to look like us. Like there are no aliens other than fallen angels in my mind. If you go back to Genesis 6, I guess you could consider that an alien. And I'm not sure what they look like. Maybe they look a little bit like those alien grays that people like to picture as aliens. I think that's all definitely possible. That could be what a demon looks like, physical manifestation of one. I think there's a lot of demonic activity out there disguising itself as alien activity. And I do think, in fact, I used to think that it was going to be a fake alien invasion that was going to kind of force this last, one world government push, because you've got quotes from like President Reagan saying the one thing that could bring the whole world together would be, a visit from an alien race, right?
Oh, Project Bluebeam, where
Project Bluebeam. I thought
where they would use the rapture to convince people that aliens are abducting people.
Yes, and they would essentially use projectors to project these things up in the sky. I thought that's what it was going to take, but after COVID and seeing how everyone just kind of caved, I was like, well, maybe we don't need an alien invasion anymore. People just stay in their homes.
Well, you said you used to think that. Why do you not think that anymore?
Well, because how easy it was with COVID to get people to stay home and take shots and do all that kind of stuff. So if it was that easy, then why do you need to waste time with an alien invasion? I think an alien invasion would be a lot cooler. It'd be a lot more fun to watch if we're still here. But, because I obviously will know that it's not real, because there's I cannot, I do not have a biblical argument for aliens from another planet.
Yeah. And I for one, believe that we're going to be raptured before everything gets wild. But, it's interesting. I mean, there is some things out there where it makes you go, well, the Bible does not talk about it, which, again, we have to be careful with what I'm about to say next. But is it possible? And I'm not talking about necessarily aliens. I'm just talking about other things. Like, people always say, it's impossible how the Egyptians made these pyramids, and then you see these pyramids all over the world. I have under good reasoning to believe that maybe people were more sophisticated back then than we are now. I mean, the movie Idiocracy kind of hit it on the head, even though it's a secular movie. As society goes on, we are getting dumber and dumber. Like, people nowadays, if you ask them who the first president of the United States was, they'll be like, Bush. Like, it's like we are getting dumber. As we're getting more advanced, we're getting dumber. But yet you look back and they were able to make these fantastic things like the Tower of Babel. Like, that is a great feat that we can't do today.
Well,
right?
in the construction industry, we refer to something as subbing it out. So if we're not going to perform the work ourselves, we're going to hire somebody else to do it. And in the case of our brains, we're subbing out a lot of that work to our phones, to Google, and it's just stuff that we're not forcing our brain to do. And one of those things is think, by the way. People are just absorbing material as opposed to actively seeking what the right answer is to something, which is a big problem. And you're right, we were far more advanced in the past, and I think far more advanced even pre-flood than possibly we are now. And yeah, you're right. I think it's a proven fact that we are devolving. We're not evolving, right? In the history of mutations, there's never been a mutation where something got better. It only gets worse, which is why the argument of evolution just falls apart. And it's why their arguments don't hold water, because the evolutionary mindset is that we are getting more advanced, that we are evolving, from slime to fish to frogs to eventually mammals to where we are today. And it just, it's nonsense.
Let me ask you another question. I'm going to kind of make this last little bit of the show a little fun.
Well, the whole show is fun.
Yeah, well, you know what I mean. But do you think maybe older societies had maybe technology that we would think would be impossible today?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I think it was probably technology that was ruined by water. I think the reason God used water to flood the earth probably had something to do with that. I think whatever that technology was, I think, God was obviously smart in the way that he destroyed it. And he destroyed it in a way that, only some of these monuments remained. These monuments that they built out of stone, and incredibly large stones, are what remained. And like you said, we still don't know how they built some of those things. Machu Picchu, we don't know how they built the pyramids in Egypt. We don't even actually know who built the pyramids in Egypt. I've heard some interesting arguments that maybe it was Adam himself that put up 2 monuments in Egypt, and there was actually 2. It was someone between Adam and Enoch got a vision that the earth would be destroyed by fire and by water. And so they built a pyramid out of brick and a pyramid out of stone. And if the earth was destroyed by fire, the brick would remain. If the earth was destroyed by water, the stone would remain. And so the thought is that and I can't remember, this is from an extra biblical text, but the thought is that the bricks got washed away and the stone remained.
Interesting. Yeah, when it comes to text outside of the Bible, I'm very wary of those.
Me too.
Me personally, just because I'm under good authority, and I was talking to my pastor about this, that the Bible of Enoch may have been made up.
I think it's totally possible.
The book of Enoch, when I say the Bible, the book of Enoch.
I think it's definitely possible. A lot of flat earthers like Enoch because it has a lot of flat earth stuff in it. And it's supposedly, quoted by the Bible. There's scholars that say that's actually not the case, that it's quoting the Bible, it was written much later. But I've heard that the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jasher, and maybe Jubilees were all three quoted by the Bible. And I have not double checked that, but I think, the puzzle that we're trying to figure out to go to heaven it's like one of those child puzzles, right? It's like that wood. You got a big alligator, and you got the alligator shape, and it's very easy to put in. The puzzle we have to solve to get to heaven is very easy, right? It's just believe in Jesus Christ, believe that he died for your sins and rose again on the third day. Very easy puzzle. The puzzle you and I are trying to figure out is like a 10 by 10 Rubik's cube of like how everything fits together.
Right.
So luckily we have the important one figured out, right? We know
Right.
where we're going when we die, but it is super interesting to speculate and try to figure out all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And whether I can trust an extra biblical text or not, I would love to trust some of them because there's a lot of cool insights, but I've definitely I have all I need to know in the Bible. If I want to spend some extra time, I might.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that's very interesting is that people say that the Bible is not accurate, that the Bible was manipulated by man, that these other texts were supposed to be in the Bible, but then they're taken out because of all the bad people. I personally believe, because I went down that road a little bit, and it took me to a dark place, and ever since then I stayed away from that stuff because I truly believe, and I truly believe that when the Lord says He preserved His word, He will preserve it. Because is He not an almighty God? Does He not?
Yeah.
Can He not stop the sun and the moon? Can He not flood the earth and crush it in half? Could Jesus not call down 12 legions of angels? Right? We have an almighty
Absolutely.
God. If He says that He can preserve His word, He can preserve it. And
it is a scientific fact that the Bible is the most accurate and reliable collection of books in the history of the world, and by a long shot. It's the equivalent of Tom Brady winning the Super Bowl 74-2 and then doing it 320 straight times. That's what the Bible does to the second place book in the history of antiquity. It's not even close. If people want to look into the reliability of the scriptures, they can. Like, the Bible holds up. I used to have a great video of it. Unfortunately, all my stuff's been deleted. But the Bible, my friends, I used to think the Bible was a crutch for weak people. That's what I thought God was. And it took me studying the reliability of the Bible and why we can trust the Bible and why it hasn't changed for thousands of years, how we can know that. It took me going through that to realize, you can be smart and listen to the Bible. Actually, you're not smart unless you dive into the Bible, because the best place to start on every subject is the written account. If we wanted to go find out when and where I was born, we would go check the written account. We'd find my birth certificate. It's the only thing you can rely on these days because everything is so fabricated on screens and in textbooks. There is such a fight for our souls and our attention. It doesn't feel like there's anywhere we can go for an absolute truth. Well, the Bible is that absolute truth. It's not one book. It's not like Buddha's book. It's not like the Book of Hindu. It's not like the Book of Mormon. It's not one book. It's a collection of 66 books written by 40 authors over a span of 1,500 years. It is a library. It is a collection of books. It's a collaboration. There is nothing else like it in the history of the world. And like I said, it is the most reliable collection of books by a long shot. Not even close.
Yeah, and and people would be like, "Well, man wrote it down." Yeah. Who else is going to write it? You see those little Instagram memes where it's like, well, who else is going to write it? Well, that's true, though. Yeah. God could write it himself if he wants to, right? But
that's the miracle about it. It was written down by man. It is a miracle. And when you study the manuscript evidence for the Bible, that's the handwritten copy evidence of the Bible, there is no other explanation than it was penned by men, through men, by God, because it is 100%. Such astonishing physical evidence for the accuracy and truth of the Bible.
Yeah, and I guess before we go, let's kind of end on this. Let's talk about this, and then we'll wrap it up real fast. As far as Bible versions, because there's two sets of manuscripts. There was the correct ones. I forgot where they came from. Then the Alexandrian texts, which were completely manipulated. which the Bible was actually written on the correct ones, but there's some people that say that these other manuscripts were accurate when they're not. And did you hear about that argument?
I did not.
Yeah, I'll have to ask my pastor about it. He has a chart. He's got a thing about it where there's these texts, but the Bible is actually written through the proper ones. But there's these texts that came out of Alexandria that were false, and people would use. That's possibly where the Book of Enoch and all those other ones came from, was these false ones. But
well, there's interesting arguments about the Old Testament and how currently it's based on the Masoretic, which is not as old as the Septuagint. So the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, was copied directly over from the ancient Hebrew. The Masoretic was translated after the Septuagint. So the weird thing is, in reality, the most ancient account of both the New and the Old Testament we have is the Greek, which is interesting because most people think, let's go see what the Hebrew says about the Old Testament. But in fact, we should be going to see what the Greek says. We should be reading the Septuagint, which, again, it's highly interesting study. I don't think it is a like change your theology type issue, but it's just something that's interesting. As far as I'm concerned, if I'm reading the Bible and I want to read a lot of the Bible, then I'm going to read it in like a conversational form. I like the modern English version. But if I'm going to read one verse and study one verse and I want to know what the word meanings are behind it, then I'm going to read the King James. And it's because I've got a Bible app, and on that app, in the King James, just about every word is underlined. If it's underlined, it means I can click on it and see the root and the etymology of it. If I'm reading something else, only like every 10th word has that. And that's because the King James is the closest English version that we have to the Greek or the Masoretic in the case of the King James in the Old Testament. So like I said, if I'm going to read modern English version. And if I see something that's really interesting and sounds kind of weird, well, then I'm going to flip over to my King James and get deep dive into the words to see if I'm reading it correctly.
Interesting. So basically, for a casual, like you're sitting back on the beach reading or something, or you're sitting in the field reading, you're going to use a more modern translation. But if something seems weird, or if you're just doing a genuine study, you go to King James. Because I'm a King James only person, right? And my brain sometimes doesn't compute. Like I'll start to like. My mind will start to hurt after a while because, but I think that's important because there is a lot of other versions that I believe are manipulated in the sense of it takes words out. Like,
absolutely. I think
it says the virgin birth, others it says a woman's birth. Well, any woman gives birth. What makes it special was the fact that it was a virgin, right?
Well, I think I think the NIV is leading the league, right? And changes like that. The NIV is known as making these like gender neutral changes that, like you said, the things about the virgin birth, that this is an issue and it's not good. And, if I found out something like that about the MEV, the modern English, I'd probably pick a different one. But I like the Bible stories, I like getting the full story, and it really helps me reading in more of a modern conversational tone to get the full story. But I don't want to miss those little nuggets, and so that's why mostly I read on my phone, because I like being able to switch back and forth, make sure I don't miss something.
Sure. All right. My wrap it up for you is, I guess, if you don't mind, maybe a quick share of your testimony whenever you accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior. If you can share that.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So when I was I grew up, we went to church like every once in a while. We went to church on Christmas, Easter, and my brother and I just complained about it constantly. We both played sports, and so we'd much rather be in the backyard playing something, on the weekend, or traveling somewhere, playing some tournament, and we really just gave my mom, too much grief, and we ended up just stopping going pretty much. And then when I was in 7th grade, I went to a public middle school, and I was getting picked on. And so I transferred to this Christian school pretty close to my house. And while I was there, we had a chapel session, and they started having a revival, and I didn't know what that meant, but a lot of people were crying, people were going up to the front, and they were playing music long after when we were supposed to have changed classes. It was supposed to be 30-minute long session. We'd been in there for like 2 hours, and a buddy of mine decides he's going to be brave enough and go up to the front. And I decided, okay, my buddy's going, I'm going to go too. So I go and I kneel down, and the pastor saying, tell him to pray, accept Jesus into your heart, all those things. And I said a prayer to myself. I said, look, Jesus, if you're real, I want you to touch me. And as soon as I said that, I felt a physical hand on my back. Like the second I asked to be touched, physical hand on my back. And the skeptical me was like, oh, that could have been my buddy, so I better pray again. And I said, okay, Jesus, if that was you, I need a sign. And I didn't even get done saying the word sign, and the bell rang to change classes. So I had like an immediate confirmation that God was real in that moment. I then, fast forward 20 years I went to an Episcopalian high school, which I didn't even have to look at the Bible one time the entire time I was there. Then I go to college and I start learning about astronomy and geology and physics. And I started reading these books that showed me how this place was created without God. And I didn't feel like anywhere I looked in the Bible or to other people, they had any good, like the Christians I knew couldn't refute the arguments that I would bring to them. So to me, Christianity ended up looking dumb. And so I was about as close to an atheist as you could possibly get, while still praying at night, just in case. Like how terrible would those prayers have been? Like, forgive me my sins, like give me this, give me that. And probably the most embarrassing time of my life, basically, if I admit to the way my head worked back then. So fast forward, I found a pastor on the radio by the name of Chuck Smith out of California, and he had a radio show where people just called in and asked questions, and he answered them. And his answers astonished me because I had never read the Bible. And so I started realizing, hey, I have based my eternal salvation on the opinions of others because I've never read this book. Can you think of anything stupider than basing your eternal salvation on the opinions of others? No. Like a close second would be allowing the government to dictate your health procedures, but by far the one that takes the cake is basing your eternal salvation on the opinions of others. So I started to read the Bible for myself, and guess what? It was totally different than what I thought. I read the book A Case for Christ, which explained to me the manuscript evidence for the Bible and how, you can't actually be a smart person and respect what the Bible says. In fact, you're, in my opinion, not a smart person unless you believe the Bible, because it means you haven't done your research. Because if you would have done your research, you'd see that it's the most reliable and accurate collection of books in the history of the world. So I decide, hey, you know what? I believe this book. I believe it more than I believe the news. I believe it more than I believe my science teachers, my university teachers. And in fact, I'm going to base all truth in this book. I'm no longer going to try to read truth into it. I'm going to let this book talk to me. And then it was a couple years later where I was watching a video on a guy who was talking about giants in Genesis 6. That's why I was following him. And he did an interview about flat Earth, and it hit me right in the heart, man. I knew as soon as he said it, it was truth. It was like I had woken up again. I knew I had been lied to, because he said, hey, you can still circumnavigate it. Check out the way the sun looks in the clouds. Doesn't it look like a local sun and not 93 million miles away? And then he said, go look and see what the Bible says. And as soon as he said that, man, I knew that if I took a literal reading of the Bible, because I had been reading Genesis, that's what I was obsessed with. I was obsessed with Genesis 1 through 11. That's creation through the Tower of Babel, 2,000 years of history crammed into like 11 pages. And it's the coolest stories in the Bible, in my opinion. And so I knew what it said. And so when he said, go look at the Bible, I was like, oh, now it all makes sense. Like before, I was trying to read this solar system created by the Big Bang, where nothing exploded and created everything, and work that into the 7-day creation account in the Bible, right? Like, well, was day one millions of years, or, was day two thousands of years? How does that work? And so it was like, wow, everything's pieced together. And then like you said, I also saw the why. I also saw that the creation is a representation of the character of God. And that would be him sitting above the North Pole, looking down on his entire creation, not him being banished to some infinite corner of the universe somewhere where, someone has the ability to convince us that, we're just a tiny little blip amongst many blips in this ever expanding universe. I realize I can remember sitting on a bench looking up at the sky, a rare cloudless sky, and just thinking like, wow, my entire world has changed. So and then that led me to meet my wife, and now we've got 7 kids together and thriving. And yeah, we've got our feet on solid ground. We're not spinning, we're not falling over. So
yeah, very good, very good. Well, it was a pleasure to have you on. We covered a lot of topics. I think it's probably gonna get this video deleted, but hey, it is what it is. Hopefully not. I'm gonna try to put
hopefully
in
my
the tags,
name's hopefully my name's not enough to get it deleted.
well, I'm gonna put in the tags like Biden is a great president or something.
There you go. Yeah.
So, but anyway, it was a pleasure. And for anyone that wants to follow you, how can they find you?
So you can find me at Matt Son of Chris on Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, and I'm on YouTube at Matt Son of Chris. I just don't have any content up yet, so I'll probably mirror this video if this comes out, and we'll see what happens.
All right, awesome. All right, well, again, this is Andrew with the Biblical Record, and there was a lot of records that was brought up today. And again, thank you, Matt, for coming on to the show. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to go to my Instagram, which is the same as my channel name, The Citizen 1776, and we'll get things knocked out for you. Again, thank you everyone for watching. Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.